Oh. Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, City University of New York, MEC. Today, of course, is Tuesday, April 14th, 2026. Let me begin by welcoming you back from spring break. This is, of course, our first office hour and lecture since your spring break. Um, Going right into the swing of things, in the previous two classes, as you will recall, we covered the following two topics: international monetary relations, that's one. And the second topic that we covered is global trade relations. As we continue this week, our third of three segments that began in Module 8, we will this week focus on trade regionalism. Some scholars see regional trade agreements, or RTAs, which is distinct from multilateralism as expressed by the World Trade Organization, or WTO, as a stepping stone to eventual worldwide liberalization of trade. However, others see RTAs, or regional trade agreements, as obstacles to global free trade. Economists describe regional free trade agreements as existing in five stages of integration. And these five stages include: one, free trade area. This is where member states eliminate tariffs and other restrictions on substantially all trade with each other. But each member state can retain its own trade policies towards non-member states. So in the example of USMCA, and I hope you know USMCA is the US, Canada, and Mexico free trade agreement. While there is, in theory, or at least as specified in the agreement, and I know that we're in a tariff regime and there are irregularities, shall we say, but sticking to the letter and spirit of USMCA, there should be a tariff-free zone between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, or as known, the North American market area. So while there is no tariff, if any, between the three countries, each of the three member countries can set their own trade agreements or tariff rates with countries that are non-party to the USMCA. That is, while there is no tariffs between US, Mexico, and Canada with respect to USMCA agreement, each of these three countries can, as an example, set their own tariffs with, say, the European Union or with, say, Japan as examples. In this way, a free trade area poses less of a threat to national sovereignty and thus more acceptable to states with politically sensitive relationships. You should know that more than 90% of regional trade agreements are free trade agreements, or FTA. The second regional trade agreement is called a customs union, or CU for short. A customs union has some of the characteristics as a free trade area, plus and includes common external tariffs, or CET, towards outside states. Put differently, in a customs union, member countries do not charge tariffs on goods traded between member countries, and they set the same tariffs on goods imported from third countries or countries outside of the customs union and territory. So remember how I said that countries within the USMCA each individual country can set their own tariffs with, say, in their trade with the European Union or, say, Japan as examples? Well, with a customs union, you don't get to do that. The markets are much more integrated. So the Regional trade agreements will determine the tariffs between each member state and non-member states. So a CU or a customs union normally creates institutions to administer the common tariff, and the custom union members have less ability to make independent decisions. Compared with free trade area agreements, the number of customs union agreements is relatively small. The most important customs union is the European Union or the EU. But as we will soon learn, the EU is more than a customs union. For instance, the EU is a customs union, is in customs union with Andorra, San Marino, Monaco, and Turkey, with the exception of certain goods, of course. And while Turkey's membership of a customs union with the EU, as an example, is recognized as having played a significant part in transitioning the Turkish economy from agrarian to industrial. However, and this is important to note, the free trade agreements signed by the EU do not extend to Turkey. As such, it is an important point to note. The EU's customs union extends to non-EU member states. So while Turkey is in a customs union with the European Union, Turkey in and of itself is not an EU member state. Consequently, there is an asymmetric trade relationship where European Union's free trade agreement partners can export to Turkey tariff-free while maintaining tariffs on Turkish goods imported into EU's free trade agreement partner countries. Unless, of course, they also conclude a separate free trade agreement with Turkey. The EU and Turkey are, however, in negotiations to amend their customs union agreement to add Turkey to EU's present and future free trade agreements. The third regional trade agreement is a common market. A common market has the same characteristics as a customs union, in addition to the free mobility of the factors of production, which of course includes labor and capital, among the member countries. As I mentioned, the EU is more than a customs union. It is indeed a common market that includes free mobility of factors of production. This increased mobility induces member states to establish similar health, safety, educational, and social security standards so that no country's labor force maintains a competitive advantage. Successful common markets are rare because they require high levels of integration, such as the EU. The fourth kind of regional trade agreement is an economic union. An economic union has similar characteristics to a common market. An economic union harmonizes members' industrial, regional, transportation, fiscal, and monetary policies. A full economic union also includes monetary union with a common currency. As discussed, 20 out of the 27 EU member states are currently part of the Economic and Monetary Union, or EMU, with adoption of the euro as their common currency. And the fifth and final type of regional trade agreement is a political union. A political union has the characteristics of an economic union and also harmonizes members' foreign and defense policies. A fully developed political union is more akin to a federal political system than an agreement among sovereign states. In this way, it is important to note that these stages of integration are models that do not fully describe reality. The US Mexico Canada Free Trade Agreement, as an example, is at stage one as an FTA. But its provisions, until recently, of course, with all the tariffs, also require more openness towards foreign investment identified with stage three, otherwise known as common market. Furthermore, some regional trade agreements in the global south that describe themselves as a customs union and common market have not actually reached those levels of integration. As an example, the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM, was originally established as a customs union in 1973 with the Treaty of Chagagoramas. Apologies if I did not do that pronunciation justice. In 2001, the revised Treaty of Chagoramas established the CARICOM Single Market and Economy, or CSME, a more advanced stage of integration that aspires to go beyond a customs union. However, CSME is still work in progress in its goal to facilitate free movement of goods, services, labor, and capital, in addition to existing free movement of goods under the customs union framework. Demonstrably, free trade agreements are much more common than customs union and single market because they do not require difficult negotiations over a common external tariff, and they do not present the same challenges of sovereignty. Although these stages are only models, they do, however, provide a general guidance to the process by which nation states become more integrated. This is especially true of the European Union, the most advanced of the regional trade agreements. Coming full circle, let us conclude by examining the theoretical perspectives between regionalism and the international political economy. In some respect, multilateralism and regionalism are competing approaches to trade. Whereas multilateralism contributes to global trade liberalization, regionalism may divide the world into competing trade blocs. However, open regionalism can break down national trade barriers and serve as a stepping stone rather than an obstacle to free trade. Regional trade agreements following open regionalism abolish barriers on substantially all trade within the regional trade agreement and lower trade barriers to outsiders. It is also helpful to acknowledge that there are sources of conflict between countries in a regional trade agreement, and these sources include: 1. Reduction of economic sovereignty and independence of economic policies. And you could tell this by the appeal for for the United Kingdom to exit the European Union, because many in the United Kingdom at the time assumed that they lost a lot of national sovereignty. They ceded a lot of national sovereignty to the European Union, and that the economic benefits were not commensurate with the level of sovereignty that they gave up in return. Economic indications of the British economy suggest that that calculation was not quite on point, but that's a conversation for another day. So, another source of conflict is unequal levels of human and physical infrastructure, in particular, transportation network. Unequal access to capital to finance trade and the lack of regulatory coherence in non-common market agreements. Can be another source of tension. These factors can lead to conflict between countries in a regional trade agreement. Now that we got that out of the way, let us conclude this week's lecture by highlighting the 3 learning objectives for the week. The first learning objective for the week is to differentiate between World Trade Organization and Regional Trade Agreements, or RTAs, Of course, World Trade Organization is also abbreviated WTO. In this way, it is helpful to note that the World Trade Organization is a global organization that promotes free trade among its member states, while regional trade agreements or preferential trade agreements between two or more countries, potentially creating exceptions to the WTO principle of non-discrimination. Accordingly, the WTO, or the World Trade Organization, of course, operates a global system of trade rules that facilitate trade among all its member countries and operates on the principle of non-discrimination or most favored nation treatment and transparency. The World Trade Organization also provides a forum for trade negotiations, resolves trade disputes until recently, as has been made obvious. Furthermore, the World Trade Organization monitors trade policies for a wide range of sectors, including trade in goods, services, and intellectual property. Unlike regional trade agreements, the World Trade Organization has a broad membership that encompasses a wide range of countries and economies. Conversely, regional trade agreements, or RTAs, are agreements between two or more countries to reduce or eliminate trade barriers, such as tariffs, and promote trade and economic integration within a specific geographical region. It is fair to also note that by their nature, regional trade agreements can be said to be discriminatory, as they grant preferential treatment to trade between member countries, thus potentially violating the World Trade Organization's principle of non-discrimination. However, proponents of regional trade agreements, which are typically formed by a smaller group of countries within a specific region, will counter that regional trade agreements facilitate trade and economic cooperation among member countries, often going beyond the scope of World Trade Organization's multilateral agreements. Despite the seeming tension between multilateralism and regionalism, the World Trade Organization recognizes the role of regional trade agreements, allowing them under specific conditions, which includes notification requirements to the World Trade Organization and adherence to certain rules, such as substantially all trade. The second learning objective for the week is to describe and explain the source of apprehension about regional trade agreements and World Trade Organization. So, according to the World Trade Organization, regional trade agreements have risen in number and reach over the years, including a notable increase in large plurilateral agreements. While non-discrimination among trading partners is one of the core principles of the WTO, however, regional trade agreements, which are reciprocal preferential trade agreements between two or more countries, constitute one of the derogations, but are authorized under WTO, subject to the set of rules. As of January 22nd, 2025, 373 regional trade agreements were in force. These correspond to 615 notifications to WTO members, counting goods, services, and accessions separately. The third learning objective is to identify and describe the different forms of regional trade agreements. Well, we have already covered the regional trade agreement that regional trade agreements exist at five stages of or five levels of integration. And these, of course, include free trade agreement or FTA. The second is customs union or CU. The third is common market. The fourth is economic union. And the fifth is political union. And with this, we'll conclude our three-part series that began in Module 8. And for next week, our focus will be on multinational corporations. So, because now we've covered a number of grounds, right? We have, over the past 3 weeks, we have covered, over the past 3 weeks, we have covered international monetary relations. So, we have to understand how countries are able to finance trade. We have covered trade, global trade relations, right? So what is the architecture of trade relations? So next week, we're going to cover multinational corporations because we want to understand the industries that are actually the engines of production that are the goods and services that are traded as a consequence or as a result of this international trading system and or architecture. So that will be the exciting conversation, lecture and conversation and class that we're going to have next week. So I thank everyone for your patience and listening through the lecture. Again, welcome back to the rest of the spring 2026 semester. And I look forward to your questions and office hour as necessary. Thank you.